Hello students, this is your mini lecture on the eating disorder chapter. I believe that's chapter 7 in your textbook. We're going to cover three main things today. The first one is looking at the three main disorders in this chapter: anorexia, bulimia, and binge eating disorder. And we're going to talk about how we're going to differentiate between the three of them. Then we're going to talk a little bit about etiology. We haven't spent a lot of time on etiology, but I do want to focus on the cognitive behavioral etiology for them. And finally, we're going to talk a little bit about social cultural perspectives in terms of etiological reasons why there are eating disorders. So those are the three things we're going to cover today in this lecture. Let's start with differentiating the three major eating disorders in this chapter. It is anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, and binge eating disorder. The chapter also talks about some childhood disorders, things like rumination and pica. We're not going to focus on those. They may be on your quizzes, but they're not going to be on your final exam. Alright, so for anorexia nervosa, we actually have three main ways that we look at the criteria in terms of determining whether or not you have anorexia. The first one is a restriction of food. You are restricting your food so much that you actually do not have a normal body weight. Previously, we actually used to say that your weight had to be below 85% of what would be normal for you, given your height and other variables. We took that 85% cutoff out, and now we're basically just saying you can't be a normal weight. So anorexia is a disorder that is very visible. You will see somebody with anorexia because they will be thinner than they should be. Second one is a fear of gaining weight. They just have this intense, ingrained fear that they're going to gain weight. And of course, a distorted body image, which can look like a lot of different things. They might look at their arms, which might be a normal size, and think that there's fat on them, or other parts of their bodies, or something along those lines. Somehow they've distorted their body image. There are actually two different types of anorexia, and this is important. There's the restricting type, which restriction is always a part of it. That would be people who mainly lose weight based upon just restricting the food, so they only have 500 calories a day or something like that. And then there's the binge purge type. So people with anorexia can actually binge on food and then purge it out through vomiting or using laxatives or exercising or something along those lines. So sometimes people get that confused because somebody with anorexia and the binge purge type might look a lot like people with bulimia. However, we're going to talk about what the major difference is between the two. So let's move on to bulimia nervosa. With this, the big difference here is, again, similar to this binge purge cycle, you have to have recurrent binge episodes. And a binge is defined as eating a lot of food in one setting. And it's really a subjective binge. So most of the time we would think about people eating things like a large pizza from Papa John's. If you eat that entire pizza by yourself, that might be considered a binge. Or you're eating an entire half-gallon of ice cream, or an entire big bag of chips, or something like that. It could be more extreme than that, or it could actually be less. So it's subjective. So once I treated a person who, for her, she would binge on bananas. And she would eat like 7 bananas in a row, and that would be her binge. Not exactly high caloric value, but that was a binge to her, and that was subjective. So we're somewhat subjective when we think about binges. And then they have these, what we call compensatory behaviors. So they binged on this food, and then they immediately feel like they need to get rid of the food. So they do that either through vomiting, or they'll use laxatives so that they're using diarrhea to get it out, or they could be doing just an intense amount of exercise. So we're not talking about an hour at the gym, we're talking about 4 hours at the gym right after they've eaten. And the key is that they've connected this binge to these compensatory behaviors. For bulimia, there is a time component here. You have to do that at least once a week for about 3 months. So if you do it once, it doesn't mean that you have bulimia nervosa. This is a reoccurring pattern that we're seeing over 3 months. And then, of course, you have that distorted body image. So let's talk about it. So both bulimia and anorexia have that distorted body image as similarities. Both of them may have the binge episodes and the compensatory episodes if it is binge purge type of anorexia. So those are some similarities. How do you separate them? Right here. This is the key to separate anorexia from bulimia. Somebody who has bulimia nervosa typically is either a normal weight or either a little overweight. They have not restricted their food so much that you can actually physically see them wasting away. Somebody with anorexia nervosa has. And so although there's a lot of overlap between these two, that's usually how we're sort of separating them, is whether or not you are severely underweight. Now let's move on to binge eating disorder. This is a fairly new category in the DSM. It was sort of a miscellaneous category prior to the DSM-5, and they have given it its own classification in the DSM-5. So again, similar to bulimia, we have these reoccurring binge episodes. Again, it can be subjective, but oftentimes we're talking about binging on high caloric foods. Chips, ice cream, sweets, cakes, pizza, tacos, you know, the stuff you eat at 2 in the morning when you're trying to study. Believe me, I was a student, I was there. We have the same time lengths here. You have to do that for at least once a week for at least 3 months. So, you know, your Taco Bell run when you're studying for finals does not mean that you have binge eating disorder. Again, it's a reoccurring pattern. How do we separate them? Right here. With binge eating disorder, there are some cognitive and emotional symptoms that come with binging. And they're not purging. So you can see here with bulimia, we have compensatory behaviors, we have some sort of purging that's happening. With binge eating disorders, they're not purging afterwards. They're just eating and eating and eating and eating and eating and feeling bad and feeling guilty and in that negative cycle, but there's nothing they do to then try to purge it out of them. So that's the big difference there between bulimia and binge eating disorder. Alright, so that sort of covers the main three. I do want to talk a little bit about etiology. The cognitive behavioral etiology is one of the most researched and probably has the most evidence in terms of anorexia and bulimia. I'm not going to talk about binge eating disorder at this point. With the cognitive behavioral etiology and anorexia, what we have is we have a person who's dieting and restricting. So they're only eating a piece of cheese when they feel like they're going to pass out. For those of you who have ever seen The Devil Wears Prada, I am channeling Emily right now. When I feel like I'm going to pass out, I eat a piece of cheese. It's great. I've lost 50 pounds. So they diet and they restrict, and then they do end up losing weight because of that dieting and that restricting. And what happens is it's actually reinforcing continuing to diet. So the lost weight is what reinforces them to keep going. Oh my gosh, I lost 5 pounds. I'm going to keep dieting, I'm going to keep restricting, and maybe I'm going to restrict even more, and that's going to cause me to lose even more weight. So it's the loss of weight that actually keeps them in that cycle, reinforcing them to continue to diet. This is a little bit different for bulimia nervosa. It's a little bit more complicated, because oftentimes we have people who are dieting and restricting at the beginning. So they might be in an intense diet just like somebody with anorexia nervosa, but that dieting leads to this negative affect for them. It's not so much they're losing weight so much that they're restricting so much. They're looking at other people eating ice cream and they're going, oh, I just want to eat a little bit, just a little bit. And then what happens is they have a slip up. They have a binge episode. So maybe they have an ice cream cone, or they have a donut or something. And then they go, right here, this is where sort of that cognitive comes in. They go, well, if I eat one, I might as well eat 10. So it's that Lay's chip sort of thing. You can't just eat one. Somebody with bulimia nervosa can't just eat one. They say, hey, I have broken my diet, so I might as well really, really break my diet. And so instead of eating one donut, they'll eat a box of donuts. And then that leads to major, major negative affect, major guilt, majorly feeling bad. I'm a horrible person. I'm so fat. Oh, I'm bad. And they feel horrible about themselves. And that's going to lead to those compensatory behaviors. Again, that could be either vomiting up what they've just eaten or taking a lot of laxatives so that they will poop out basically what they've eaten. Although that doesn't actually work because most of those nutrients have already been absorbed. Laxatives don't actually work for losing weight. But when they do them, whenever they throw up or they're using laxatives or whatever, then they feel better. They go, oh, I just threw up that whole pizza, now I feel better. So it's actually the compensatory behaviors that reinforce the cycle. So they'll feel better about themselves, and they'll go back to dieting and restricting, and then that cycle will just continue. So in both of these, there's different reinforcing behaviors. The behaviors that they do that keep them in the cycle. For anorexia nervosa, it's simply the loss of weight, and the more weight they lose, the more that's going to be reinforced. And for bulimia nervosa, it's that compensatory behaviors that reinforces them to keep staying in that cycle. Finally, and the last thing I just want to point out is that social cultural perspective etiology, which basically says that there's something that's going on in the culture, there's something that's going on in society that's actually having a hand in causing these eating disorders. And eating disorders is one of them that has the strongest evidence for social and cultural stuff. And we have 4 different lines of research that the book sort of divides it up into. One of the main ones is the fact that we know that eating disorders are increasing over time. So even though we've had the incidence of eating disorders sort of throughout history, we've never had a prevalence rates like we have now. And so there's something going on that changed in society that then changes sort of why we have these eating disorders. And a lot of people pinpoint when the industry flipped over around the 50s, I think it was, in the 60s, when we started having models, instead of being Marilyn Monroe, you know, a little bit bigger, a little bit more curvy, we started having models that were much thinner, like Twiggy from England. You can look her up if you don't know who she is. And she was very thin, almost boy-like, very small. And so then it became an issue that, oh, that is what beauty is, not these big, curvaceous women. So eating disorders changed over time. That's one piece of evidence that says maybe it's about society, not so much about other things like biology or psychology. 2, we do have a huge imbalance in terms of the sex ratio. Many more women will suffer from anorexia, bulimia, and binge eating disorder than men. I think with anorexia, some estimates are even, it's like 1 to 10. Bulimia, it's a little less, about 1 to 4, and binge eating disorder also a little less, about 1 to 3 or so. But still, women, on the whole, suffer from eating disorders more than men. If it's not about society, then what's going on? It's really hard to say that there's sex differences if it's not about society. This is a big one, and some of the stuff that I asked you to look at on Moodle actually speaks to this. It's the internalization of that thin ideal. And so looking at models in magazines, looking at ad campaigns, and judging ourselves based upon sort of that thin ideal, what you're supposed to look like in society. We find that people who adhere to that, so we can give them a measure and they can kind of say whether or not they adhere to that thin ideal, they're at a higher risk for eating disorders. So yes, I should look like models in magazines. And the final one is this idea of different rates in different cultures. So the American culture, the Western European culture, has the highest incidence of eating disorders because we have that thin ideal strongly in place. Cultures that don't have that either don't have any eating disorders at all or have a very low incidence. There's a study, the Becker study, that they did on women in Fuji, and the prevalence rates of eating disorders before Americanized television was introduced and after, and they saw this huge increase after they started watching our TV shows, which again sort of have that thin ideal part of it. So those are the 4 different lines of research, things that I think are really important for you to look at as you're studying eating disorders. Again, if you have any questions, make sure that you post them on Moodle, and I'll see you in the next video.